All right, welcome to part 2 of the study guide. Do me a favor, make sure you really pay attention to the last, 10 to 15 questions on today's video, because those are things that we really never got to, or at least didn't get to them really well. So you really need to watch this video to do well on that part of the exam. But we left off with some imperialism questions, negative effects of imperialism in Africa. And one of the ones that is still affecting Africa to this day is Europeans went in when they colonized and they drew the borders. Europeans drew the borders. And that'd be, with my classes, I said that'd be like a substitute teacher making a seating chart. They would have no idea because they don't know the students. And they would put some students together who don't need to be together, and they would separate students that were just fine together. And that's what Europeans did to the continent of Africa. They put groups together that did not need to be together. And that's led to civil war after civil war after civil war. And I guess it's just really hard. Once these borders have been created, it's really hard to go back and change them. But these poorly drawn European borders, let me say that again, poorly European drawn borders are still causing problems. And it's one of the worst effects of, imperialism in Africa. All right, now this is a pretty famous political cartoon of this time period, and that is a picture of a British guy named Cecil Rhodes, and he controlled, his company controlled some ridiculous amount of territory in Africa. At one point, he controlled like 90% of the world's diamonds, or some ridiculous amount of the world's gold and diamonds. But as you can see, he's definitely standing on the continent of Africa. And he's got what looks to be like a string there in his hands, and that's supposed to be a telegraph line. And if you, you can't really see the caption here, but this is showing his intention of installing or helping to get telegraph lines all the way from Egypt, which is where his left foot is sitting, all the way down to South Africa, where his right foot is sitting. So this is just an English guy, wealthy businessman who had a lot of influence in Africa and British imperialism of Africa. All right, one more point about imperialism. During the age of imperialism, Britain, if it was a competition like who can get the most colonies, Britain was probably definitely the winner. They literally had land all over the world. And as a result, during the age of imperialism especially, they had this nickname for their empire. It was called the Empire on which the sun never sets, because literally, if you have land all over the world, the sun will always be shining on a piece of your empire. So Empire on which the sun never sets is the British Empire during the age of imperialism. All right, some World War I questions now. As you know, hopefully, World War I was nicknamed the war to end all wars. And a lot of this was because of the style. It was trench warfare. If you remember early on in the war, the Germans were winning, and they started getting a little pushback, and they didn't want to lose too much ground, so they dug in. And then once the Germans dug in and dug trenches, the French and British did the same. And part of that was because they had machine guns now, and in the trenches was a safe place to hide from the machine guns, so machine gun fire. So one of the biggest drawbacks of this war is that the style was trench warfare. So literally, it's like football. You get out of your trench and you try to gain yards, but unlike football, you're getting shot at. All right, so it's a terrible style of fighting. Just human loss after human loss after human loss, crazy numbers of death. And just for a little bit of land, and you might lose 10,000 men and gain half a mile a day, and then tomorrow or the next week, you might lose 100,000 men and lose the land right back. So it's just really small land gains, but lots of people are dying. And that's just one of the huge drawbacks of trench warfare. Pitifully small land gains, but lots of people are dying. That's how I got the nickname, the war to end all wars. Surely we wouldn't be stupid enough to fight that sort of fight again. And really, we haven't really fought a war like that again. World War II with new technology wasn't a trench warfare type war. So we really haven't fought another style of war like that one. But we have fought other wars. Let's see here. Okay, Russia. Russia plays a huge role. They're on the good team. but they pretty much always lose. So are they doing any good if they're always losing the battles? And the answer is yes. Okay, so here's why. My hands here, Germany. And let's see, on one side over here, they would be having to fight France and Britain over here. And then once Russia gets involved, they got to fight Russia over there. So you can see they're fighting a two-front war. Now, if it weren't for Russia, they could focus all of their attention on France and Britain, and it would have been a pretty quick victory for the Germans. So even though Russia almost always loses its battles, they're forcing the German army to split in half and fight a two-front war. Without Russia's help, the good guys probably don't win this war. So thank you, Russia, for helping the Allies out in World War I. All right. Okay, another World War I question. Germany was doing this thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. And their plan was they were trying to hurt Britain. They were trying to cut off supplies to Britain. So any boats going in and out of the island of Britain, they were going to blow up. And it's unrestricted because there's no restrictions. They will blow up who they want to, when they want to, where they want to. And they won't even know. Like, you'll just be floating in the Atlantic Ocean and suddenly you're dead. Unrestricted submarine warfare. And the most infamous example of a boat that got blown up because of this was the Lusitania. It was a British ship, but there were about 120 or so American citizens on it. So that got America. We didn't declare war immediately, but that certainly was one of the events which was edging us closer and closer to getting into World War I. So unrestricted submarine warfare, when Germany, using its submarines, would just blow up any ship off British waters, anytime, any place, without warning. All right. Fast forward to the end of the war. The good guys won. Germany was the big loser. And, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that came at the end of this war. And with the war guilt clause, it put total 100% blame on Germany. Like, they blamed the whole thing on Germany. So Germany's going to get punished severely. They lose all this land. Their army has to be shrunk down. They owe the world payment for all the damages caused. It's called reparations, like $31 billion or something crazy like that. So it just really, really punished Germany severely. Now, when you get in trouble, and your parents go off on you or your teacher, and you feel like they went way overboard, like they went really crazy on you, I'm sorry about my dog barking. You're not feeling like, oh, I love my teacher right now, or I love my parents right now. Like, you're pretty bitter and pretty resentful. And that's how the German people felt. Like, they were mad. Okay. They felt like the treaty had over-punished them. And it left them bitter and angry. And that's going to allow this guy named Hitler to rise to power. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles was not good for Germany, on Germany, and like I said, a legacy of bitterness and anger in the hearts of many German people. All right, Russian Revolution. Okay, so that happens right... Sorry about that. My son came in yelling at me. Okay. Russian Revolution happens right at the end of World War I. All right. So basically what's happening, you have this family, the Romanov family. They've been in charge for at least 300 years. And the people in Russia want a change, some events that lead to this. Well, first of all, it's just an old-fashioned, sort of oppressive government. Other countries have become more modern. Other countries are starting to have more and more rights and freedoms and democratic ideas. But Russia's still kind of stuck in that old-fashioned autocratic. It means it's like when a ruler has total, complete power. And, they just want more freedom, more rights, more influence in the government. Some other things. There was this one Sunday when you had these workers protesting, peacefully, unarmed protest. They wanted things like an elected parliament. They wanted better working conditions. They wanted the right to vote and things like that. And the Russian army opened fire on them, killing I can't remember how many, but killing many of them and injuring many more of them. So when your own army starts opening fire on your own citizens, that is not good, and that makes the government look really bad. So that was called Bloody Sunday. That was definitely one event which is going to lead to this revolution. Another thing, World War I, I told you a few minutes ago, Russia was losing battle after battle after battle. I mean, there were a lot of Russian boys getting killed, men getting killed, and it certainly was an unpopular war in Russia. And you blame the government when there's an unpopular war. When there's an unpopular war, you blame your government. So World War I was a huge reason as well. And then there's this creepy guy named Rasputin, and he apparently healed the Tsar's son from this terrible blood disease, hemophilia. And as a result, the Tsar and his wife thought this Rasputin guy was like the best thing since sliced bread. So they probably let him have a little bit too much influence in the government. So imagine some like really creepy looking dude, kind of weird, kind of psycho, having a lot of influence on the government. That would not be good either. So to review, Bloody Sunday made the government look bad. World War I made the government look bad. And letting Rasputin have all that influence made the government look bad. Okay, so in Russia, they get rid of the Romanov family, and that lasts for about 3 or 4 months. And the temporary government they had set up until they could come up with a more permanent government, permanent constitution. The temporary government's actually going to get overthrown. So in this 1 year, 1917, the Romanov family gets overthrown, and then the government that replaced it gets overthrown as well. And they're going to get overthrown by this group of people called the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were people who agreed with the writer Karl Marx. They wanted to basically take from the rich and distribute all that out to the poor, take land away from the rich, give it to the poor. So they were Marxist, but they were not afraid of violence. They were not afraid of doing drastic things. So they were radical, and they were Russian, and they were Marxists. So they're radical Russian Marxists, and they're going to overthrow the temporary Russian government and set up their own government. And they will then become known as the communists. So radical Russian believers of Karl Marx, and they eventually become the Communist Party. Okay, let's see here. All right, so now we're getting closer and closer to World War II. And what we see in the 1930s, especially in Italy and especially in Germany, is they are going to allow some really, and even Japan too, to a certain extent, they're going to let some really crazy dictator dudes take over. And the question is, in the 1930s, why do some countries let these crazy dictators take over? Okay, why do people just give up their democracy and their freedoms and some of their rights? And why do they just let these crazy dictator guys take over? Well, a couple reasons. First of all, during the 30s, the economy was awful. Okay, people are starving to death. It was a worldwide depression, and hopefully none of us have ever been in that situation, but if you're starving to death, like literally you have no money, you have no rent, you can't pay rent, you can't buy groceries, and some dictator guy comes along and says he can make your life better, what's more important, like the right to vote or having a little food and money? Okay, so people had to make that tough decision. So these terrible economic times put people in really drastic situations where they were willing to try anything. And if that was like, hey, let's try what this dictator maybe he can make our lives better. They were willing to try it. Second thing, these dictators are good at playing on people's emotions and their fears. And, these Hitler types and these Mussolini types knew how to manipulate people and use their fears against them and play on their emotions. So that was certainly a part of it. And then these guys came around, and even though they were crazy and they were dictators, they came around and said, look, we're going to do this and this and this. We're going to make these simple actions, and it's going to make everything better. So They offered simple solutions to these complex problems. They made these promises that, hey, we can make your life better. So, why did people give up their freedoms? It was a terrible economy. They were desperate, willing to try anything. These dictators knew how to play on the people's fears and emotions and manipulate them. And they promised to make life better. They gave solutions to problems, and they promised they would make their lives better. Okay, so before World War II actually starts, there was a Spanish war, a Spanish Civil War. A fascist had taken over Italy. His name was Mussolini. A fascist had taken over Germany. His name was Hitler. And there's some guy in Spain who thinks that he can do the same thing. Some fascist guy wants to take over his government. But the reason why it's really an important event, this Spanish Civil War, is Hitler is going to send help to the fascist guy, and he's going to use it sort of like a scrimmage or a practice war, because he's planning on a big war happening soon, World War II, and he wants to try out his new planes, his new tanks, his new style of fighting. So Hitler uses this as like a warm-up or a practice war for World War II. All right. As you know, the thing that gets us involved in World War II, America involved, is the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Japan basically has become industrialized, has become modern, has become strong, and now they want to become an empire builder. And we are kind of standing in their way. They're wanting to build an empire in the Pacific. And in that part of the world, us and our friends have already sort of colonized. So we're kind of standing in their way, and they decided to take us out. Okay, so they want to get us out of the way so they can build that empire like they wanted. So on December 7th, 1941, they're going to attack Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, and that gets us involved in World War II. Another major important battle of World War II was Normandy. Okay, so Normandy is in France. So this is us invading France. Many of you are probably thinking, why would we invade France, who was our friend? Because at this point, France is controlled by Germany. So we're actually invading German-controlled France. And it was an amphibious invasion, which means we start off on the water, and we go up on the beaches. Those are very deadly, very difficult. There's nowhere to hide on the beach. So they've got machine guns all up high, kind of shooting down at the beach. So it was just a really bloody day, but one that we had to endure. It's kind of like getting our foot in the door, so to speak, in Europe. And then once we controlled that beach, then we could bring in more men and tanks and equipment. But we had to get our foot in the door. And that was what Normandy did. It started the long process of slowly driving the Germans back into Germany. So D-Day, also called the invasion of Normandy, very important battle. It started the long process of defeating the Germans. Okay, back over in the Pacific, we were losing for a long time after Pearl Harbor, until the turning point over there was the Battle of Midway. And after that, we were definitely winning. And we went on the offensive, which meant we started doing the attacking. It was impossible to attack every single island that they had stolen, or not stolen, that they had conquered. We're not going to be able to conquer back every single island. So our strategy was island hopping. We would pick and choose which islands to try to take back. And the first island we hopped on was a place called, the first major island after this was Guadalcanal, and it was a nasty jungle. So just the environment itself was deadly. Snakes, alligators, scorpions, fire ants. I mean, everything could kill you on that island. But then you also had the fanatical Japanese soldiers there with their never surrender attitude, and that just made it a whole lot worse. So overgrown jungle of an island, Guadalcanal. And that was a 6-month long battle, but it was eventually a victory for America. After that, we want to get the Philippines back. We had control of it before Pearl Harbor. CJ, turn it down, please. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are going to take it from us, and we're pretty much we can't do anything about it. And we actually order our General MacArthur off the island. We do not want him. He's too valuable. We don't want him to fall into enemy hands. So he left abruptly, leaving his men behind, but he had orders to do so. And his last words were, "I will be back." Unfortunately, the island would fall. Our POWs, our prisoners of war, were forced to go on an awful march across the Philippines. It was called the Bataan Death March, and you can imagine by the name how awful that must have been. We do, after Guadalcanal, we do come back now that we're stronger, and we attack the Philippines, and we take it back. And MacArthur's first words when he got back were, "I have returned." So we lost it, but now we got it back, the Philippines. And then we get to a point, we take over a few more islands, like Iwo Jima is a famous one, Nagasaki is a famous one, and we get to the point then where the only island left is actually Japan itself. And we know that they are going to fight harder than ever to protect their own island. We know they have a never surrender attitude, and we know that we would lose thousands, maybe 500,000 American soldiers if we invaded the old-fashioned way. So we'd been working on a new weapon called the atomic bomb. And our president at the time, Truman, decided that he would rather drop those 2 bombs than risk American soldiers and losing their lives. So a few things that are true about this. We did it so that we wouldn't have to send in troops, and which would lead to possibly 500,000 American troops dying. We not only dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, but we also dropped it on Nagasaki. And after those two, the Japanese did end up surrendering to us. And then another little fact about it is we never told the Soviet Union, who was our ally at this time, we never told them about this secret weapon. We never told them that we were going to be using this secret weapon. And that kind of made them mad. I think they were kind of jealous that we had these weapons and they didn't. They were kind of scared that we had these weapons and they didn't. So these 2 bombs are actually going to lead to some tension between us and our ally, the Soviet Union, and actually help lead to the Cold War and an arms race during the Cold War. Okay, we're getting to the part of the final where it's the most recent stuff, or some of the stuff I barely covered or didn't quite cover, and you really need to pay attention to these last 8 or 9 minutes of this video here, so you'll do well in this last portion of the final exam. So the United Nations, that is a group that is still around today. It replaced the League of Nations. If you remember, after World War I, a League of Nations was formed, and the goal was to try to stop future wars from happening. It was too weak and didn't work. World War II broke out, so it did not work. But after World War II, it gets replaced by the United Nations, which is still around. So the purpose of that United Nations, which we are a part of, we weren't a part of the League, but we are a part of the United Nations, is just to protect against future aggression, to stop any future wars, try to keep the peace, stuff like that. Okay, a little bit of Indian history. As you know, India for a long time was part of the British Empire, and they do eventually win their freedom in the 1900s thanks to a guy named Gandhi. Gandhi, that's why he's famous, for helping India win its freedom from Britain. And he had this style that Martin Luther King Jr. would copy here in America, and it was called civil disobedience. And that word civil means, they're going to be civilized. They're not going to be crazy and like just reckless. They're going to be civil and civilized, but they're not going to be obedient. Okay, they're going to disobey, but in a very civilized way. Okay, so the purpose of that, he's wanting to encourage Indians to disobey unfair British laws, ignore unfair British laws, show no respect to British authority, not necessarily do what the British tell them to do, but in a very civilized way. And, they're hoping to prove to Britain that India can be its own country, okay? And, again, Martin Luther King Jr. copied these civil disobedience tactics here in America during the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so just trying to encourage Indians to, in a civilized way, disobey and show no respect to British authority and prove to the British government that India was its own country. And it worked, and India does eventually become free because of Gandhi and his tactics. All right, Israel. Very quick history on Israel. Christians and Jews believe that land was promised to Abraham by God. Okay, that's the promised land. That's what Jews and Christians believe. Well, the Jews left and went to Egypt for a while, got enslaved there. Moses, according to the Old Testament, leads them back out of slavery, back to Israel, where they have to fight to win Israel back from, the folks like Goliath, David and Goliath story. That's what that's all about. Well, fast forward, the Romans eventually come in and conquer them, and they don't get along with the Romans, and they end up spreading out, mainly all over Europe. They leave their homeland to get away from the Roman Empire and spread out all over Europe. So that's how they ended up in Germany and Austria and Russia. Hundreds of years ago, they had left to get away from the Roman Empire. So World War II happens, Holocaust happens, and the United Nations now wants to get involved and give them a place they can call their own. And since many of the United Nations members were Christian countries, the United Nations decided to give them back Israel. Now, it had been like 2,000 years since they'd been in Israel. So the United Nations kind of scooches these folks over, the Palestinians kind of, hey, y'all scoot over because we're putting the Jews here. And as you can imagine, that led to some tension. So it's the United Nations that created this plan for Israel to be their own independent country of Jewish people. But then the Jews, like almost from day one, had to protect themselves and fight for that independence. Okay, South Africa, going way back to imperialism there, when you had the British and the Dutch in South Africa. You had a relatively small number of white European-born people living amongst a large population of African-born people. And what they end up doing is creating the system of racial discrimination and white superiority called apartheid. And it became like the laws. It was built in, and it became, apartheid was the way, the legal way down there, which kept whites and blacks apart, and it kept whites in South Africa superior. It was very much similar to like segregation in the Jim Crow South, but perhaps even worse, because it was like literally written in the laws this way. So that's what apartheid was. It will not end until 1994, like mid-90s, thanks to Nelson Mandela, who helps bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. Okay, after World War II, communism spreads all across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union is communist, Yugoslavia is communist, half of Germany is communist, and it's going to stay that way for about 50 years. It's called the Cold War. You have countries like us and Britain, non-communist countries, and communist countries aren't getting along. There's really icy tension between us for about 50 or so years, and that was called the Cold War. Well, a symbol of communism sort of collapsing and coming undone and the Cold War coming to an end was when the Berlin Wall was taken down. It's called the Fall of the Berlin Wall, and there's pretty famous pictures of this wall with spray paint all over it, and the people of Berlin, tearing it down. It literally went straight down the middle of Berlin, and you had east side was communist and the west side was not. So the fall of the Berlin Wall was kind of a symbol of the beginning of the end of the Cold War and communism. All right, there's been quite a few genocides that we've talked about in world history. Of course, there was the Holocaust, but there was one in the 90s in Africa in Rwanda. And there's a famous movie, many of you have probably seen it, called Hotel Rwanda. But basically, you have these two groups of Africans, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And because of imperialism, I'm not sure, they might not have gotten along before imperialism, but definitely once Europeans got there, they sort of favored one of those groups over the other. And one of those groups was probably treating the other pretty poorly. And anyway, fast forward to the 1990s, those two groups were still very bitter against one another. And one of those groups tried to exterminate the other one. And it was a really, really terrible event, an example of genocide there in Rwanda. And it was because of a dispute between the Hutus and the Tutsis down there in that part of the world. If you look at this globe from the 1980s, this is probably 1984 or so, you will see where it says Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And you'll also see, let's see, I'm going the wrong way, where it says somewhere, it says Yugoslavia as well. If you look at today's globe, it's different. So what caused those map changes in the 1990s? It would be the collapse of communism, the failure of communism. The Soviet Union broke apart, and today it's called Russia, and then there's other parts that used to belong to the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia broke apart. It is now places like Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia. Also on that globe, you'd have seen in East Germany and West Germany, they're back together. So all of those map changes would have been because of the failure of communism. Okay, so today we're not really battling communist countries anymore. Today our foreign policy revolves around terrorist countries, and fighting terrorism is very challenging because you don't really know who they are. They don't wear uniforms. They're in many countries all over the world. It's not like you're just having to fight one country. They're all over the place. They have lots of money, many times, lots of resources. Like I said, they're in hiding. You can't really tell who they are. So those are all things that make it challenging to fight terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and others. And last but not least, even though we in America have never had a female president, there have been female leaders in the 1900s. In Great Britain, they had a female prime minister named Margaret Thatcher. And in Israel, they had a female prime minister named Golda Meir. So there have been women leaders of national governments in other countries, like in Israel, Golda Meir, and in Britain, Margaret Thatcher. And we will have one soon, but we have not had one yet. Okay, that does it for this final exam review. You'll be taking this on Tuesday, and if you've watched these two videos, you will do a great job. Good luck, and take care. All right, we'll see you.